The February wind of 1878 carved through Willow Springs, Montana, like a blade, fresh from the blacksmith's forge, driving snow in stinging sheets that transformed the small frontier settlement into a world of white and gray. The harsh gusts rattled windows and sent chimney smoke spiraling wildly into the leaden sky, while drifts accumulated against the false-fronted buildings that lined the town's single main street. Leonora Hartwell drew her threadbare woolen shawl tighter as she emerged from Mackenzie's general store. Her leather satchel containing 3 carefully mended work shirts that would earn her barely enough to buy flour and coffee for the week ahead. At 32, she moved with the measured grace of a woman who had learned that survival on the frontier demanded careful calculation of every step, every penny, every decision that might mean the difference between warmth and cold sustenance and hunger. Her blue calico dress, though patched at the elbows and faded from countless washings, remained spotless and properly pressed, a testament to dignity maintained despite the grinding poverty that had become her constant companion since Lucas's death. The fabric had been a gift from her husband during their first hopeful year in Willow Springs, when silver from the Cold Creek mine had promised prosperity for hard-working families willing to endure the harsh realities of frontier life. Now, Lucas was dead 18 months, killed in what territorial authorities had ruled a mining accident when unstable rock collapsed in the tunnel depths. But Leonora carried doubts that gnawed at her, like persistent hunger suspicions that his death had been too convenient, too perfectly timed to solve certain problems for certain powerful men who viewed human lives as obstacles to be removed rather than sacred trusts to be protected. She could still hear his voice sometimes in the wind's howl, still feel his gentle hands on her shoulders during those quiet evenings when they had planned their future together. Lucas had been a dreamer, but also a practical man, someone who believed that hard work and honest dealing would eventually triumph over corruption and greed. His discovery of irregularities in the mine's water rights documentation had excited him tremendously. In those final days, he had spoken of justice, of exposing wrongs, of building something better for the generations that would follow them to this harsh but beautiful land. 3 days later, he was dead crushed beneath tons of rock, in a section of tunnel that had never shown signs of instability before or since. The town's main thoroughfare stretched before her, flanked by establishments that projected frontier prosperity, but concealed the harsh mathematical realities of survival in a place where winter could kill the unprepared, and summer brought its own dangers. Smoke rose from stone chimneys in desperate columns, quickly scattered by winds that howled down from peaks where no human footprint had ever marked the snow. Willow Springs existed for 3 interconnected reasons that formed the foundation of its precarious economy, and the natural spring that bubbled clear and warm from underground depths, never freezing even in the harshest cold. The Cold Creek mine that extracted silver from the mountainside 3 miles southeast of town, and the railroad spur that had arrived 2 years prior to carry that precious metal east to distant markets, where men in expensive suits determined the value of frontier blood and sweat. The spring was the heart of everything, sustaining both the growing settlement and the Lakota families who had made seasonal camps here for countless generations. For Wicassa's people, this place held sacred significance. They called it water that never sleeps, honoring the eternal flow that had sustained their ancestors through drought and plenty, war and peace, the endless cycles of life that connected all living things to the earth's mysterious bounty. But that same life-giving water had become the center of a struggle that threatened to tear the small community apart, pitting neighbor against neighbor in conflicts over access, taxation, and the fundamental question of who possessed the right to control resources that nature herself had provided freely to all. A commotion near the town center caught Leonora's attention. Raised voices cutting through the wind's persistent howl, accompanied by the unmistakable sounds of violent struggle that made her heart clench with familiar dread. Through the swirling snow, She could see three rough men in heavy coats dragging a young woman toward a battered wagon, while a fourth stood guard with a rifle that gleamed dully in the gray afternoon light. The victim was Mary Slocum, barely 25, and thin as a rail from the poor eating that marked her as one of Willow Springs' most desperate residents. She took in washing when she could find work, which wasn't often in a town where most folks did their own laundry to save precious coins for necessities like flour coffee and the ammunition that might mean survival when civilized law failed to protect the innocent. "I ain't done nothing wrong." Mary's voice carried clearly, despite the wind high with terror, and the desperate defiance of someone who had learned that submission to injustice only invited greater cruelties. "I don't owe nobody $12. That's more money than I see in 6 months of honest work." The largest of her captors, a barrel-chested man whose black beard hung greasy and unkempt to his chest, spat tobacco juice that steamed in the snow and left a dark stain on the pristine white surface. Greasy Pete Morrison says different, girlie. Says you've been living high on credit at the Rattlesnake Bar, eating good food and taking up valuable space without proper payment for services rendered. Everyone in Willow Springs knew it was a transparent lie, the kind of cruel fiction that powerful men used to justify whatever actions served their purposes. Mary Slocum lived in a single cramped room behind the abandoned bakery, surviving on charity scraps and the occasional dime earned from washing clothes in water so cold it left her hands raw and bleeding. But Pete Morrison's gang used debt collection as cover for darker purposes, intimidation, extortion, and crimes that decent people preferred not to name aloud in polite company. The man holding the rifle stepped closer to Mary, and Leonora could see clearly now that he carried a Winchester Model 1866, its brass receiver gleaming like gold against the gray sky. The weapon had earned the nickname Yellow Boy among frontier fighters, and its presence in the hands of Pete's enforcer spoke to the level of violence these men were prepared to employ against anyone who opposed their will. But then Pete himself spoke up from the wagon seat, his voice carrying a threat that made Leonora's blood turn to ice water in her veins, freezing her in place. With the terrible recognition that this confrontation was about more than Mary's fabricated debt. Besides, Pete drawled his pale eyes, finding Leonora across the snowy street with the predatory focus of a wolf selecting its next victim. "Mary, here ain't the only one with outstanding obligations in this town. That seamstress lady there still owes for her husband's bar tab, don't you, widow woman? Dead man's debt's gotta be paid by somebody, and Lucas ain't around to settle accounts no more." The words struck Leonora like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and leaving her dizzy with shock and mounting rage. Lucas had never been a drinking man, had possessed the steady temperament and clear judgment that made him valuable as a mine foreman. His single visit to Pete's establishment had been strictly business delivering payroll money under official orders from mine management. The claim was as false as Mary's supposed debt, but it revealed something far more sinister than simple extortion. Pete Morrison and his masters were systematically targeting anyone they perceived as vulnerable or potentially troublesome, using fabricated debts as legal justification for whatever actions served their broader purposes. The widow of a man who had asked inconvenient questions about water rights would naturally find herself facing similar pressures, similar threats, similar choices between submission and resistance. The gunman with the Winchester swung his weapon between Mary and Leonora, his finger resting on the trigger with the casual indifference of someone accustomed to killing. Maybe we should collect both debts at the same time. Save ourselves a second trip on such a miserable day. That's when Wicassa stepped into view, emerging from the blowing snow like a figure from ancient Lakota legends of warriors who appeared when justice demanded a champion. He walked with the unhurried stride of someone who had faced death often enough to recognize it. Without fear, his movements carrying the fluid grace that came from decades of surviving in a world where weakness invited destruction and hesitation meant death. His buffalo hide coat bore the accumulated white of hours spent outdoors, and eagle feathers hung from his long gray braids, secured against the wind with strips of painted leather that marked his status as a respected leader among his people. At 58, Wicassa's weathered face bore the deep lines carved by hard winters and harder choices. But his dark eyes remained sharp with intelligence. And something else, a barely contained fury at witnessing injustice committed against those who possessed no power to defend themselves. His right hand rested with deceptive casualness on the worn stock of his Henry rifle, a weapon from Civil War days that remained deadly accurate in the hands of someone who understood the mathematics of violence. The brass receiver of the Winchester immediately swung toward the approaching Lakota warrior, its muzzle tracking him with mechanical precision. "Keep walking, Redskin. This business don't concern your kind, and you'd best remember that before somebody teaches you a permanent lesson about knowing your place." Wicassa didn't alter his pace or direction, but something in his posture shifted subtly, like a mountain cat, gathering itself for a strike. When he spoke, his English was precise and unaccented, the product of years spent learning the white man's language to protect his people through negotiation rather than the warfare that had consumed so many of his generation. "Seems like it concerns anyone who believes women shouldn't be dragged through the streets like sacks of grain," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute certainty despite its conversational tone. "My grandmother taught me that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those who can't fight back." Leonora found herself holding her breath as tension crackled between the two men like electricity before a thunderstorm. She had seen Wicassa around town before, a diplomatic figure who worked tirelessly to maintain peace between his diminished band and the growing number of white settlers who viewed Lakota presence as an obstacle to progress. His people had suffered terrible losses in recent years, their numbers reduced by disease warfare and the systematic destruction of the buffalo herds that had sustained their traditional way of life for countless generations. But there was something in his bearing now that spoke of barely leashed violence, like a wolf deciding whether the situation demanded blood or could still be resolved through the mere threat of fangs and claws. His weathered hands remained steady despite the cold, and his breathing showed none of the agitation that marked lesser men when confronted with armed opponents. Pete Morrison rose from his wagon seat with theatrical slowness, a sawed-off shotgun cradled in his massive arms like a sleeping child. His reputation for casual brutality extended throughout the territory, and men spoke his name in whispers when discussing the price of opposing certain interests in Willow Springs. "You got some considerable nerve, old man," Pete observed with the tone of someone discussing the weather rather than contemplating murder. "This here's white folks' business conducted according to territorial law and proper commercial practice. You'd best remember your place in the natural order before somebody reminds you permanent-like about the consequences of overstepping boundaries that were established for good reasons." The gunman's finger tightened visibly on his trigger, the brass receiver of his Winchester catching what little light filtered through the storm clouds. "Last warning, Redskin. Walk away while you still can, or find out how fast Yellow Boy here can punch holes in troublemakers." What happened next unfolded with shocking speed and lethal precision, like lightning splitting the sky during a summer thunderstorm. Wicassa's left hand shot forward like a striking snake, grabbing the Winchester's brass receiver and twisting the weapon skyward just as the gunman's finger completed its pull. The rifle discharged with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding buildings, its bullets screaming harmlessly into the gray sky, while Wicassa used the weapon's weight and his opponent's surprise to spin him completely off balance. Mary Slocum broke free of her captor's loosened grip and dove behind a nearby water trough, her thin form disappearing behind the wooden barrier, as the other three men clawed desperately for their pistols. But Wicassa was already moving with the fluid efficiency of someone who had learned violence as a young man and perfected it through decades of survival in a world that showed no mercy to the slow or hesitant. His Henry rifle appeared in his hands, as if conjured from thin air, the well-oiled action working smoothly despite the bitter cold. The wooden stock of the captured Winchester caught one attacker across the jaw with a sickening crack of breaking bone, dropping him unconscious into the blood-stained snow, where he lay motionless as falling flakes began to cover his still form. A second man managed to clear his Colt revolver from its holster, but Wicassa's rifle spoke before the pistol could find its target. The heavy bullet took the gunman in the shoulder with devastating force, spinning him around like a child's top, and sending his weapon flying into a snowdrift where it disappeared beneath the white surface. Kill them all. Pete's voice roared above the chaos as he struggled to bring his shotgun to bear on targets that refused to remain stationary long enough for careful aim. Don't let nobody make fools of us. Not today, not ever. The street exploded in violence as the remaining gunmen opened fire wildly, their shots lacking the precision that came from training and discipline. Muzzle flashes bloomed like deadly flowers in the white chaos, while bullets whined off building walls, shattered storefront windows, and sent splinters of wood flying through the air like horizontal hail. Leonora pressed herself against the general store's wall, her heart hammering against her ribs as lead whistled past, close enough to tug at her heavy skirts. She could see Wicassa moving through the storm with the predatory grace of a born warrior, his rifle delivering measured responses to the wild shooting around him. Each shot was placed with careful consideration, designed to disable rather than kill when possible, reflecting a code of honor that set him apart from the men who had initiated this violence. Mary remained pinned behind the water trough, crouched low, as bullets chipped frozen wood from its rim and sent ice fragments flying in sharp, glittering shards. The young woman's face showed the pale determination of someone who had decided that death was preferable to whatever fate Pete Morrison had planned for her in the Rattlesnake Bar's back rooms. Without conscious thought, Leonora grabbed a handful of snow from the drift beside her, packed it tight around a jagged stone from the street, and hurled it with all her strength at the nearest gunman. The improvised missile struck him squarely between the eyes, with enough force to spoil his aim and send his shot wide of its intended target. The distraction gave Wicassa the opening he needed to put another round into the man's leg, dropping him screaming into the snow where he writhed in agony, while crimson spread through the white crystals beneath him like spilled wine staining a tablecloth. This way. Wicassa called his voice, carrying clearly, despite the chaos, as he noticed blood beginning to seep through a tear in his buffalo hide coat. He grabbed Mary's trembling arm with his free hand and pulled her toward the narrow space between buildings, with Leonora stumbling after them through drifts that reached nearly to her knees. More shots erupted behind them as they reached the alley's relative safety lead, whining through the air and striking sparks from metal fixtures mounted on the building walls. Pete Morrison's voice boomed over the gunfire, like thunder rolling across the prairie. Find them, search every building, every hiding place. Nobody crosses Pete Morrison and lives to tell tales about it. In the protected space between Mackenzie's store and the old boarding house, the three fugitives huddled together while their breath formed silver clouds in the frigid air. Wicassa's wound was bleeding more steadily now, dark stains spreading across his heavy coat where the bullet had creased his shoulder without hitting bone. Mary shivered uncontrollably in her thin dress, her face pale with shock and the advancing effects of cold that could kill as surely as any gunshot. Around them, they could hear boots crunching through snow as Pete's men spread out to search every alley, every hiding place, every possible escape route, with the systematic thoroughness of hunters who understood that wounded prey often proved most dangerous when cornered. The wind carried threats and curses, promises of brutal retribution for anyone who dared oppose the established order in a town where power flowed from the barrels of guns rather than the consent of the governed. You hurt bad?" Leonora asked, reaching instinctively toward Wicassa's injured shoulder while trying to assess the extent of damage through the torn fabric. He shook his head slightly, though she could see pain tightening the weathered lines around his dark eyes. "Flesh wound. Seen considerably worse in my time fighting for my people's survival. You ladies need to get somewhere safe before they corner us like rabbits in a trap." Mary pressed against the wall behind them, tears freezing on her young face as the reality of their situation began to sink in. "What did we do wrong? All I wanted was to walk home without being bothered by men who think they own everything and everyone in this town." "Nothing," Wicassa said firmly, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime distinguishing between justice and its absence. "You did nothing wrong except exist in a place where decent people are seen as obstacles to be removed rather than citizens to be protected." Leonora studied his weathered features in the dim light, filtering through the storm, noting the way he carried himself despite injury, and the calm competence he displayed under pressure. Something about his unshakable determination in the face of violence reminded her powerfully of her late husband Lucas. Not physical resemblance, but the same quality of moral courage that never bent regardless of pressure or threat. Lucas had possessed that same quiet strength, that same willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it meant risking everything he held dear. In their brief marriage, she had learned to recognize the look that came over his face when he encountered injustice, a kind of focused intensity that transformed him from a gentle dreamer into someone capable of facing down any opposition. She could still remember their last real conversation just 2 days before the cave-in that claimed his life. He had been excited about something he had discovered in the mine's administrative records, some irregularity in water rights documentation that he believed could help protect the Lakota families from eviction. His eyes had held that same fire she saw now, in Wicassa's gaze, the flame that burned in men who refused to accept that might made right. "I know somewhere we can go," she said quietly, making a decision that would change everything that followed. "Walter Kruger's farm. It's upstream about 2 miles, and Walter's got his own reasons to hate Pete's people and anyone who works with them." The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, accompanied by harsh voices coordinating a systematic search that would eventually flush them from their hiding place like quail driven from cover. They had perhaps minutes before Pete's gang reached the alley and discovered them cowering like frightened animals in the narrow space between buildings. Wicassa checked the loads in his Henry rifle with practiced efficiency, his movements economical despite the injury that sent fresh blood seeping through his coat. "Best move now, while the storm gives us some cover. Once they organize proper and bring up lanterns, we'll be sitting ducks with nowhere to run." They slipped deeper into the maze of backlots and storage sheds that served the town's businesses, moving as quickly as the treacherous footing would allow, while trying to avoid leaving tracks that could be followed easily. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew more organized and determined, as Pete's men coordinated their hunt with the methodical precision of professionals who had performed similar tasks many times before. The creek that marked Willow Springs' southern boundary was locked in winter's iron grip, its surface bearing thick ice that would support their weight, but made every step a potential disaster. They crossed in single file, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the still air, while snow continued to fall around them like a curtain of white silence that muffled all sound and reduced visibility to mere yards. Walter Kruger's farm lay 2 miles upstream from town, where the German immigrant had carved out a modest homestead through backbreaking labor and the stubborn determination that marked his people's approach to frontier survival. His log cabin and barn were built to withstand Montana's brutal winters, with thick walls carefully chinked against the cold and roofs sloped steep to shed even the heaviest accumulations of snow. The Kruger family had arrived in Willow Springs 3 years earlier, driven from their previous home by drought and the economic pressures that forced many farming families to seek new opportunities in territories where land remained available to those willing to work for it. Walter's wife Anna had died the previous winter from lung fever, leaving him to raise their two boys, Henrik 12 and Johann 10, while working soil that barely produced enough to keep them fed through the harsh months when nothing grew and survival depended entirely on careful preparation and stored resources. But as they approached through the swirling storm, Leonora noticed something that made her heart sink with growing dread. No smoke rose from the cabin's stone chimney. No warm light showed in its windows. No signs of normal domestic activity suggested that the family was weathering the storm in comfort and safety. The entire farmstead appeared oddly deserted, abandoned to winter's mercy in a way that spoke of either absence or something far worse. Walter himself appeared suddenly from behind his barn rifle in hand, and his weathered face creased with an emotion that took Leonora a moment to identify as guilt, mixed with desperate, consuming fear. Behind him came his two boys, Henrik and Johann. But something was fundamentally wrong with the scene, something that set alarm bells ringing in her mind, even as relief at reaching apparent safety flooded through her exhausted body. "Mein Gott," Walter said, but his heavily accented English sounded forced and rehearsed, as if he had been practicing the words while waiting for their arrival. "What brings you to my farm on such a terrible night? Surely you know the dangers of traveling in weather like this." That's when Leonora saw them additional figures moving in the shadows around the barnmen with rifles who were trying to stay concealed but had positioned themselves to cut off any possible escape route. Walter's farm wasn't sanctuary at all. It was an elaborate trap carefully prepared and expertly executed. "Walter," she said quietly, her voice carrying the terrible certainty of someone who had suddenly understood how thoroughly they had been betrayed. "Where are Henrik and Johann supposed to be right now? What's really happening here?" The German farmer's weathered face crumpled with anguish, and when he spoke, his voice broke with the weight of unbearable shame. "They have my boys," he whispered, tears beginning to freeze on his cheeks in the bitter air. "Sheriff Klaus took them this morning before dawn, said they would be returned safe and unharmed if I helped them catch you and your friends." Sheriff Roland Klaus stepped into view from behind the cabin, his tall figure unmistakable even through the storm's white chaos. A former cavalry officer who had served with distinction during the Indian Wars before taking up territorial law enforcement, Klaus commanded respect through fear and systematic brutality rather than any pretense of legitimate authority. His pale eyes held the cold intelligence of a predator who enjoyed both the hunt and the eventual kill, and his expensive clothes marked him as someone who had found ways to profit handsomely from his position. Touching reunion. Klaus observed his voice carrying the educated tones that marked him as someone who had received proper schooling back east before coming west to make his fortune through whatever methods proved most expedient. Walter here has been most cooperative in arranging this little gathering, though I suspect his heart wasn't entirely in the work. 3 deputies emerged from concealment around the farm buildings, their weapons trained on the fugitives with professional competence. But Leonora could see that Klaus had brought more than just local law enforcement. Several faces belonged to hardened gunfighters, professionals who killed for money, rather than any pretense of justice or territorial authority. The sheriff's pale eyes found Wicassa and held his gaze with the predatory focus of a man who had made a career of breaking those who opposed his will. "The famous Wicassa," Klaus said with mock respect. "War chief diplomat survivor of more battles than most men see in nightmares. I've been looking forward to this meeting for quite some time." But before Wicassa could respond, Dr. Edwin Carruthers stepped from the cabin's interior, his medical bag in hand, and his lined face set with quiet determination that spoke of moral courage overcoming natural fear. The town's physician was followed by Beatrice Sullivan, the young schoolteacher whose dedication to education had made her beloved by children from all backgrounds, and Thomas Bell, a carpenter whose own family had fallen victim to one of Otto's accidents the previous year. All three were armed with rifles, despite having little experience with violence, their faces showing the grim resolve of ordinary people who had been pushed beyond endurance by systematic oppression and casual cruelty. Klaus's expression shifted from confident satisfaction to wary calculation as he realized that his carefully planned ambush had been compromised by the arrival of additional players who had not been accounted for in his strategy. "Dr. Carruthers," the sheriff said with false courtesy, "you're interfering with official territorial business. These people are wanted for assault on lawmen and disturbing the peace of a lawfully established community." What I witnessed was 3 citizens defending themselves against kidnapping and extortion. Dr. Carruthers replied steadily, his voice carrying the authority that came from years of service to people who depended on his skill and integrity. "And what I see now is a corrupt sheriff using innocent children as hostages to commit additional crimes against decent people." The standoff stretched taut as winter wind, with armed men on both sides, waiting for someone to make the first move that would unleash violence across the farmyard and determine who lived to see another dawn. The snow continued falling steadily, adding another layer of complexity to tactical calculations that could mean the difference between survival and death for everyone involved. But before anyone could fire a shot, young Henrik Kruger broke free from his captor's loosened grip and ran toward his father, his boyish voice cracking with emotion as he called out words that would shatter the temporary balance. "Papa, I told them you wouldn't really betray good people. I told them you were just pretending to help them so you could protect Johann and me." The deputy who had been guarding Henrik struck the boy with vicious backhand that sent him sprawling in the snow blood, streaming from his split lip as he struggled to rise on shaking limbs. The casual brutality toward a 12-year-old child was the spark that ignited the powder keg of tension that had been building around the farm. Wicassa's Henry rifle spoke first, its heavy bullet taking the deputy who had struck Henrik and lifting him clean off his feet with the devastating impact of a .44 caliber round fired at close range. Dr. Carruthers' hunting rifle boomed almost simultaneously, shattering the shoulder of another gunman who was drawing his pistol with lethal intent. The farmyard exploded in chaos as both sides opened fire muzzle flashes, lighting the storm like deadly lightning, while men shouted orders and curses through the smoke that quickly filled the air. Klaus dove for cover behind Walter's wagon, while his surviving men scattered to defensive positions among the farm buildings seeking protection that would allow them to continue the fight. "Get the boys inside," Leonora shouted to Beatrice as bullets whined through the air around them like angry hornets seeking targets. "Keep them down and away from the windows." The battle that followed was brief but intense with both sides, recognizing that darkness and weather would soon make accurate shooting impossible. Klaus's superior numbers were offset by the defenders' knowledge of the terrain and their desperate motivation to protect innocent lives from men who viewed children as acceptable casualties in pursuit of their goals. As the gunfight raged around them with lead flying and men bleeding into the snow, Leonora's mind worked furiously on a problem that had been nagging at her since their arrival. Klaus had known exactly where to set his trap, had anticipated their movements with precision that suggested detailed intelligence about their plans and intentions. Someone had been feeding him information, but the question remained who possessed access to their discussions and decisions. The answer became clear as she noticed fresh horse tracks leading from the farm toward town tracks that had been made since the storm began, indicating recent communication with Klaus's forces. Walter's guilt hadn't stemmed solely from having his children threatened by corrupt lawmen. He had been actively reporting on anyone who sought shelter at his farm, providing detailed information about their movements and plans. But understanding Walter's betrayal also revealed something else. If Klaus knew their current location, he would certainly know about any other places they might seek refuge. The German farmers' cooperation had been thorough and systematic, leaving them with nowhere to run and no allies they could trust completely. As the fighting continued around them, Leonora made a desperate decision, born of desperation and the growing certainty that their only hope lay in gathering evidence of the conspiracy that was systematically destroying their community. While Wicassa and the others kept Klaus's men pinned down with accurate rifle fire, she would attempt to slip away and make her way to the mine office where Conrad Otto kept his most sensitive records. If she could gather documentary proof of the corruption that had claimed Lucas's life and threatened everyone who opposed the established order, they might still have a chance to bring outside intervention that could save both their lives and their community's future. But first, she needed to survive the battle that was turning Walter's farm into a killing ground, littered with the bodies of men who had chosen violence over justice, profit over human decency. The siege of Walter Kruger's farm continued through the long winter night, with Klaus's forces maintaining a careful perimeter, while the defenders held the barn and cabin against steadily mounting pressure. Snow fell continuously, muffling the sounds of sporadic gunfire and turning the farmyard into a white wasteland marked by dark stains where men had bled and died for causes they barely understood. Inside the barn's hayloft, Leonora worked by flickering candlelight to tend Wicassa's shoulder wound, while Dr. Carruthers treated 2 other injuries among their small group of defenders. The Lakota warrior's injury was more serious than he had initially admitted, with the bullet having chipped bone before exiting through muscle, leaving damage that would require careful attention to prevent infection. "You need to rest that arm," she told him as she finished cleaning and bandaging the wound with strips torn from her petticoat. "Too much movement could restart the bleeding and cause complications we can't treat properly under these conditions." Wicassa tested his grip on his Henry rifle, wincing slightly, but maintaining enough function to operate the weapon effectively. "Rest is a luxury we can't afford right now. Klaus isn't planning to wait us out through patience. He's preparing something that will end this siege quickly and permanently." Through gaps in the barn's log walls, they could observe unusual activity among the besieging force. Men were moving equipment from their horses, setting up what appeared to be some kind of heavy apparatus in the shelter of Walter's woodshed, working with the focused efficiency of professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan. "Dynamite," Walter said grimly as he joined them in the loft, his weathered face haggard with guilt and exhaustion that had aged him years in the span of hours. "Klaus took explosives from the mine yesterday evening. I heard his men talking about using them to bring down buildings if the siege lasted too long." The implications were terrifying. Dynamite would end their resistance quickly and brutally, bringing down the barn's walls and killing everyone inside while eliminating any chance Klaus had of interrogating prisoners about what they knew regarding Otto's operations. But it would also represent an escalation that might attract unwanted attention from territorial authorities who preferred their corruption to remain subtle. "Why does he want us alive if he's prepared to use explosives?" Leonora asked, voicing the question that had been troubling her throughout the night. "What's Klaus really after here beyond simple elimination of witnesses?" Dr. Carruthers looked up from bandaging Thomas Bell's wounded hand, his lined face reflecting years of treating injuries inflicted by men who viewed violence as a solution to inconvenience. "Evidence?" he said quietly. "Klaus knows we've been gathering information about Otto's operations and the broader conspiracy. He needs to find out exactly what we know and who else might have copies of incriminating materials." But Walter shook his head with the slow emphasis of someone who had learned terrible truths through forced cooperation with evil men. "Is not just about evidence, or even eliminating witnesses. Klaus, he has much bigger plans than just working as Otto's enforcer. I saw documents when I was copying records, heard conversations that showed Klaus making his own deals with railroad companies and territorial officials. The revelation struck the group like a thunderbolt, illuminating the true scope of the conspiracy they faced. If Klaus was pursuing his own agenda, rather than simply serving as Otto's subordinate, it would explain his seemingly irrational tactics and his willingness to risk open warfare in the middle of a settled community where violence might attract federal investigation. What kind of deals? Wicassa asked sharply, his dark eyes reflecting the candlelight as he leaned forward despite the pain in his wounded shoulder. Walter's expression grew even more troubled as he recalled details that had seemed merely curious at the time, but now revealed their sinister significance. Klaus has been selling detailed information about Lakota movements to military contractors who want to justify federal intervention in territorial affairs, also making secret agreements with railroad surveyors about land rights through traditional hunting grounds that belong to your people by treaty. The scope of Klaus's ambitions was staggering in its cynical calculation and systematic betrayal of everyone he was supposed to serve. The sheriff wasn't just stealing from individual families or eliminating troublesome witnesses. He was orchestrating a comprehensive campaign to dispossess an entire people of their ancestral lands, while enriching himself through multiple revenue streams that depended on continued conflict and federal military intervention. That's why he needs to control the narrative about tonight's events. Leonora realized with growing horror. If word gets out about his real activities and the methods he's using, it could bring federal investigators who might uncover his entire network of corruption and conspiracy. Before anyone could respond to her observation, a new sound reached them through the storm, the rumble of approaching wagons, accompanied by many horses suggesting the arrival of substantial reinforcements that would tip the balance decisively against the defenders. Through the swirling snow, they could see a considerable force approaching the farm, and their numbers far exceeding anything Klaus had commanded earlier. But these weren't additional deputies or hired gunfighters. The newcomers were dressed in expensive clothes despite the harsh weather, and carried themselves with the bearing of men accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them from others. At their head rode Conrad Otto himself, the mine owner whose silver-filled mountains had made him one of the most powerful and influential men in the entire territory. Otto was a thin man in his mid-40s with prematurely gray hair and pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw for future use. His expensive Eastern suit remained immaculate despite the harsh conditions, and he carried himself with the supreme confidence of someone who believed money could solve any problem and eliminate any obstacle to his ambitions. Klaus. Otto's voice carried clearly across the farmyard as he dismounted from his covered carriage with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to physical discomfort. What in blazes is taking so long? Well, this simple operation should have been completed hours ago. The sheriff emerged from his position behind Walter's wagon, his face flushed with anger and frustration at having his competence questioned in front of subordinates. These people are considerably more resourceful than your intelligence suggested. They've established strong defensive positions and possess enough ammunition to hold out for days, if necessary. Otto surveyed the siege with obvious displeasure, his calculating gaze taking in the tactical situation and finding it severely wanting, according to his standards of efficiency. I didn't invest substantial money in your operation to watch you fumble a simple arrest and elimination. End this immediately, using whatever methods proved necessary. But Klaus's response revealed the deeper tensions and mutual distrust that characterized their partnership. Maybe if you had been completely honest about what we were really dealing with, Otto? That Lakota warrior isn't some reservation drunk. He's a war chief who's killed more trained soldiers than you have fingers on both hands. and the woman has more backbone and intelligence than most men I've encountered. The heated exchange provided crucial intelligence to the defenders listening from their concealment in the barn. Otto and Klaus were allies of convenience, rather than genuine partners, with each man pursuing his own agenda, while using the other for temporary advantage in a larger game neither completely understood. What matters now? Otto continued with the cold precision that marked his approach to business problems. Is that none of these people survived to tell tales about what they might have seen, heard, or discovered. Use the dynamite if necessary, but stage it to look like an accident or Indian raid. We cannot afford witnesses who might communicate with federal marshals. The callous discussion of their murder sealed the defenders' fate while revealing important information about Otto's psychology and priorities. He was more concerned about maintaining appearances than achieving maximum efficiency, a character flaw that might provide exploitable weaknesses if they could survive long enough to take advantage of them. As the two men continued their heated discussion about methods and timing, Leonora made a decision that would determine everything that followed. While the others maintained their defensive positions and prepared for the final assault, she would attempt to slip away from the farm and make her dangerous way to the mine office where Otto's most sensitive records were kept under guard. If she could gather documentary evidence of the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives, it might provide the leverage needed to bring outside intervention from federal authorities who possessed both the power and motivation to investigate territorial corruption. The plan required her to cross 3 miles of open country in a blizzard while avoiding mounted patrols, reach a heavily guarded facility, and somehow penetrate Otto's private office without detection. The odds against success were astronomical, but the alternative was certain death for everyone in the barn when Klaus tired of waiting and decided to use his explosives to end the siege permanently. "I'm going to the mine," she told Wicassa quietly as they prepared for what might be their final battle together. Otto's personal records are kept there under lock and key, and they represent our only hope of proving what's really happening in this territory. Wicassa's dark eyes reflected the candlelight as he studied her determined face, seeing something there that reminded him of warriors he had known, who possessed the rare courage necessary to undertake missions from which return was unlikely. "Too dangerous," he said simply. "Klaus will have mounted patrols watching all the established roads, and the weather conditions are getting worse by the hour. That's exactly why I might succeed where others would fail," she replied with quiet conviction. "Nobody expects anyone to be crazy enough to attempt travel in conditions like these. And if I don't make the attempt, we all die here anyway, when Klaus decides to use his explosives." Dr. Carruthers overheard their whispered conversation and moved closer, setting down his medical instruments to reach into his leather bag. "If you're absolutely determined to make this attempt," he said quietly, "you'll need to document whatever evidence you find in a way that can't be disputed later." Instead of producing a camera, which would have been impractical under the circumstances, he handed her a small leather portfolio containing writing materials and official territorial letterhead that he had acquired through his medical practice. "Copy the most important documents word for word, including dates, signatures, and any official seals. Written evidence verified by witnesses can be just as compelling as photographs in territorial court." As they made final preparations for her departure, none of them suspected that young Henrik Kruger was listening intently from his position near the barn's rear wall. The 12-year-old had inherited his father's strong sense of justice and his late mother's quick intelligence, and he was forming his own desperate plan to help the adults who had risked their lives to protect him and his younger brother from Klaus's brutality. The escape attempt began just after midnight, when the storm reached its peak. Intensity and visibility dropped to mere feet in any direction. Leonora slipped out through a loose board in the barn's back wall, carrying the leather portfolio and what little ammunition she could spare for the small pistol Dr. Carruthers had insisted she take for emergency protection. The 3-mile journey to the mine complex became a nightmare of cold exhaustion and constant fear of discovery that tested every limit of human endurance. Wind-driven snow cut visibility to nothing, while temperatures dropped toward levels that could kill exposed flesh in minutes, turning each step into a conscious act of will against the body's natural desire to seek shelter and warmth. She navigated by instinct and memory, following creek beds and ridge lines that she hoped would lead her toward Otto's mountain stronghold, without exposing her to the patrol routes that Klaus's men would be watching. The buffalo hide coat that Wicassa had insisted she borrow provided crucial protection against the elements, its thick fur trapping body heat, while shedding the snow that accumulated constantly on every exposed surface. Twice she was forced to hide from mounted patrols that appeared suddenly through the storm, for their horses' hooves muffled by snow, but their voices carrying clearly in the thin mountain air as they coordinated search patterns designed to intercept anyone attempting to travel between the farm and town. Klaus had indeed posted guards along the main routes, but the patrols were limited by the same weather conditions that hampered her own movement, creating opportunities for someone willing to accept extreme risk. After what seemed like hours of struggle through drifts that sometimes reached her chest, the lights of the mine complex appeared through the swirling whiteness like a vision of industrial hell. The facility sprawled across the hillside like a small city devoted entirely to the extraction of wealth from the earth's depths, with the stamp mill's constant thundering providing acoustic cover for any sounds her approach might generate. Otto's administrative building stood at the complex's heart, a substantial 2-story structure that housed both his business offices and his private living quarters in the territorial fashion that combined work and residence, for men whose wealth isolated them from normal social interactions. Light showed in several windows, despite the late hour indicating that the mine owner had returned from the farm and was conducting whatever urgent business couldn't wait for morning. Leonora circled the building carefully, studying its approaches, while looking for the weakest point of entry that would allow her to reach Otto's records, without alerting the guards she knew would be posted around such a valuable target. A rear window that provided ventilation for the building's storage areas appeared to offer her best option, narrow enough to discourage casual intruders, but accessible to someone desperate enough to accept the risks involved. The window was indeed unlatched, a detail that spoke either to Otto's confidence in his security arrangements or to the general assumption that no one would be foolish enough to attempt burglary during a blizzard. She managed the entry with only minor scrapes and bruises dropping into Otto's storage room, where crates and barrels stood like silent sentinels guarding supplies necessary for the mine's continued operation. Moving carefully through the building's interior, she made her way toward the administrative offices where Otto's most sensitive records would be kept under lock and key. The corridors were dimly lit by oil lamps turned low for the night, creating pools of yellow light separated by stretches of shadow that provided concealment for her careful progress. The sound of voices from Otto's private office made her freeze in place, pressing herself against the wall, while trying to determine how many people were conducting business at such an unusual hour. Through the partially open door, she could see Otto himself seated behind his massive desk, while 2 other men stood before him in attitudes that suggested they were receiving orders rather than participating in discussions among equals. The situation at the farm has become more complicated than anticipated. Otto was saying, his voice carrying the cold precision that marked his approach to problems requiring violent solutions. Klaus's methods lack subtlety, and his personal ambitions threaten to expose operations that depend on discretion for their success. One of the other men, a professional gunfighter whose expensive clothes marked him as someone who commanded high fees for specialized services, nodded understanding. "What are your specific instructions regarding the sheriff's future usefulness to the organization?" Otto's response chilled Leonora's blood, while confirming her growing suspicions about the true nature of the relationship between the territory's most powerful criminal figures. Klaus has outlived his usefulness and become a liability that threatens everything we've built. His elimination should appear to result from the night's violence, preferably at the hands of the very people he was supposed to capture or kill. The casual discussion of murder revealed that Otto had been planning Klaus's betrayal while maintaining the pretense of partnership, using the sheriff's resources and local knowledge, while preparing to eliminate him when his services were no longer required. The revelation added another layer of deadly complexity to an already desperate situation. As the men continued their planning session, Leonora realized that her presence in the building provided an unexpected opportunity to gather intelligence about Otto's broader operations while he believed himself secure from observation. Moving with extreme care to avoid creating sounds that might alert the guards she knew were posted throughout the facility, she made her way toward the records room where Otto's most sensitive documents would be stored. The door was locked, but her hairpin skills developed through necessity during her difficult widowhood served her well once again. Inside, she found filing cabinets lined against the walls like repositories of carefully organized corruption, each drawer labeled with categories that spoke to the systematic nature of Otto's criminal enterprise. Working by the light of a single candle that she shielded carefully to prevent its glow from showing under the door, she began searching through Otto's meticulously maintained files. Most contained routine business correspondence, but she quickly located the locked cabinet that held his most sensitive materials relating to territorial politics, railroad development, and the systematic elimination of obstacles to his expanding empire. What she discovered exceeded her worst expectations about the scope of corruption that had infected the territorial government. Otto's personal ledgers documented not just local bribery and intimidation, but a territory-wide conspiracy involving railroad companies, federal contractors, and elected officials whose votes could be purchased for prices that seemed shockingly modest given the wealth and power they controlled. Bribes, extortion, and systematic murder were recorded with the methodical precision of a bookkeeper tracking routine business expenses, each entry representing lives destroyed and communities devastated in service of corporate profits that flowed eastward to investors who would never see the human cost of their dividends. But it was a separate set of files that revealed the true scope of Klaus's betrayal and the mortal danger it represented to Otto's continued operations. The sheriff had been keeping his own detailed records hidden within Otto's system, but documenting a parallel conspiracy designed to eliminate his supposed partner and seize control of the entire territorial network for his own benefit. Klaus's meticulous notes revealed his comprehensive plan to orchestrate a series of manufactured Indian raids that would justify federal military intervention while eliminating both Otto and any witnesses who might threaten his takeover of the existing criminal infrastructure. The sheriff had been playing an elaborate double game from the beginning, using Otto's resources to build his own power base, while preparing to eliminate his partner when the timing proved most advantageous. Working with desperate efficiency, Leonora began copying the most incriminating documents in her careful handwriting, transferring Otto's recorded admissions of murder and Klaus's detailed plans for territorial conquest onto the official letterhead that Dr. Carruthers had provided. Each page she completed represented another piece of evidence that could bring federal intervention if she survived to present it to authorities with the power to act on such revelations. But as she worked, voices in the corridor outside grew louder and more numerous, indicating that Otto's business meeting was concluding, and the participants were preparing to disperse to their various assignments. She had perhaps minutes to complete her copying and escape before being discovered by men who would kill her without hesitation if they learned what she had found in their employer's private files. The most damning document proved to be Klaus's personal journal, hidden behind Otto's legitimate business records, but containing a complete confession of his role in Lucas's murder. The sheriff had recorded the details with the same methodical precision he applied to all his criminal activities, noting dates, methods, and motivations with the thoroughness of someone who believed his records would never be discovered by hostile eyes. According to Klaus's own written admission, he had forced Lucas into an unsafe mine tunnel at gunpoint after learning about the water rights documentation that threatened Otto's control of territorial resources. A deliberate cave-in had been triggered only after Klaus shot Lucas in the leg to prevent escape, ensuring that the accident would leave no survivors to contradict the official story of structural failure and poor safety practices. Walter Kruger had witnessed the entire murder from concealment while delivering supplies to the mine, but had been too terrified to come forward after Klaus threatened similar treatment for anyone who questioned the official investigation. The German farmer's guilt and shame had eaten at him for 18 months, explaining his willingness to cooperate with Klaus's demands, even when it meant betraying people who trusted him. As she finished copying Klaus's confession, Leonora heard footsteps approaching the records room with the deliberate pace of someone who suspected that normal security had been compromised. She had seconds to conceal her presence before being discovered by armed men who would view her as a threat, requiring immediate elimination. But the room offered limited hiding places, and the window she had used for entry was too narrow for quick escape under pressure. Instead, she moved quickly to the storage area, adjacent to the records room, concealing herself behind wooden crates and canvas-covered supplies, while clutching the leather portfolio containing evidence that could bring justice for Lucas and salvation for her community. The door to the records room opened with a soft creak of hinges, followed by the sound of someone moving systematically through the space while checking for signs of intrusion. Leonora held her breath and pressed herself deeper into the shadows, knowing that discovery would mean not only her own death, but the loss of evidence that represented their only hope of exposing the conspiracy that had claimed so many innocent lives. Otto himself entered the storage area where she was hiding, carrying a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the walls, while he conducted what appeared to be a routine security inspection. His pale eyes swept the space, methodically cataloging every detail with the attention of someone who had learned to trust no one completely in his rise to power. For a moment that seemed to stretch across eternity, his gaze passed directly over her hiding place, without detecting her presence among the stored supplies. Then he turned and left the room, apparently satisfied that his private documents remained secure from prying eyes. But even as relief flooded through her, Leonora realized that her escape route had been compromised by Otto's inspection. Guards would now be posted at all the building's exits, making departure far more dangerous than her initial entry had been. She needed to find another way out of the administrative building before dawn made concealment impossible and doomed her mission to failure. The solution came in the form of a delivery chute that connected the storage area to the building's loading dock, where ore wagons were loaded for transport to the railroad depot. The chute was designed for moving supplies rather than people, but it offered a direct route to the exterior that bypassed the corridors where guards might detect her movement. The slide down the wooden chute was harrowing but brief, depositing her on the loading platform where snow continued to fall heavily enough to provide concealment for her escape from the mine complex. Behind her, lights were beginning to appear at windows throughout the facility, as Otto's security force organized search parties to hunt for the intruder, whose presence had somehow been detected, despite the careful nature of her infiltration. But she was already moving through the storm toward Walter's farm, clutching the leather portfolio that contained documentary proof of the conspiracy, while praying that her friends had survived the night's violence. The sound of dogs reached her through the wind, the same hunting hounds that Klaus had used earlier, now pressed into service by Otto's men, who were determined to prevent any evidence from reaching federal authorities. The journey back to the farm became a race against time and weather, as her strength began to fail, and the cold penetrated even the protection of Wicassa's buffalo hide coat. Behind her, the baying of hounds grew steadily louder, as they followed her scent trail through the snow with relentless efficiency. But as despair threatened to overwhelm her exhausted body and numbed mind, Leonora heard something else through the howling wind gunfire from the direction of Walter's farm, indicating that the siege was entering its final phase while she struggled through the wilderness with evidence that might save everyone she had learned to care about. She forced herself to move faster despite the deepening cold and her own approaching collapse, driven by the knowledge that lives depended on her success, and that failure would mean not only her own death, but the triumph of evil men who viewed human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. The farm appeared through the storm just as her strength was nearly exhausted, but what she saw there filled her with new dread and desperate determination. Buildings were burning against the night sky, while dark figures moved among the flames like demons conducting business in hell itself. But this wasn't Klaus's final assault on the defenders. Instead, she was witnessing something far worse, the systematic elimination of Klaus's forces by Otto's professional killers, who had arrived to clean house permanently and ensure that no witnesses survived to threaten their employer's expanding criminal empire. The real battle for Willow Springs was about to begin, and everything would depend on whether she could reach safety with the evidence that could bring federal intervention before Otto's men completed their murderous work. The sight that greeted Leonora as she approached Walter's farm through the blinding snow filled her with a mixture of horror and desperate resolve. The cabin was fully engulfed in flames that reached toward the star-filled sky like prayers for the dead, while the barn still stood, but showed signs of damage from the sustained gunfire that had marked the night's violence. Bodies lay scattered across the blood-stained snow in testimony to the brutal efficiency with which Otto's professional killers had eliminated Klaus's forces. But the burning buildings also illuminated something she hadn't expected, and this wasn't Klaus's final assault on the defenders at all. Otto's men had arrived first, eliminating the corrupt sheriff's entire force in a brief but vicious firefight that had left the farmyard littered with corpses before turning their attention to the remaining witnesses who might threaten their employer's carefully constructed network of corruption and murder. Through the smoke and flames, she could see Otto himself directing operations from his covered carriage protected from the elements, while his hired killers prepared for a final assault on the barn where her friends were making what appeared to be their last stand against overwhelming odds. The mine owner's strategy had become clear through his actions: eliminate Klaus and his men to remove the threat of betrayal, then kill everyone who had witnessed the night's events to ensure that no inconvenient testimonies could reach federal investigators who might ask uncomfortable questions about territorial law enforcement methods. Leonora circled wide around the farm, using the burning buildings for concealment, while she tried to find a way to help the defenders without exposing herself to Otto's gunmen. The leather portfolio containing evidence of the conspiracy pressed against her ribs with every movement, a constant reminder that justice depended on more than just surviving the immediate violence. As she drew closer to the barn, she could hear familiar voices from inside Wicassa calling orders to conserve ammunition, Dr. Carruthers treating someone's wounds, Beatrice Sullivan comforting the terrified Kruger boys with the gentle authority that made her beloved by children throughout the territory. They were still alive and fighting, but their situation appeared hopeless without immediate intervention from sources that seemed unlikely to materialize. That's when she spotted a small figure moving carefully through the shadows behind Otto's carriage, someone too small to be one of the gunfighters, but familiar in a way that made her heart leap with recognition and simultaneous dread. Young Henrik Kruger had somehow escaped from the barn and was positioning himself for what appeared to be a suicidal attempt to assassinate the man responsible for his father's death and his family's destruction. The 12-year-old was carrying his father's old army revolver, a weapon far too large for his small hands, but which he gripped with the desperate determination of someone who had seen too much violence visited upon innocent people. His boyish face showed the hollow-eyed resolve of someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly in a world where adults failed to protect those who depended on them. Leonora realized with growing horror that Henrik was planning to trade his own life for a chance to end Otto's reign of terror. The kind of heroic gesture that ballads celebrated and reality punished with swift death. She had to stop him before he got himself killed uselessly while simultaneously finding a way to coordinate their actions for maximum impact against their enemies. Moving as quietly as possible through the snow, she worked her way closer to Henrik's position while keeping watch for Otto's sentries. The boy was focused intently on the mine owner's carriage, calculating angles and distances, with the concentration of someone who understood this would be his only opportunity to strike back against the forces that had destroyed his family. "Henrik," she whispered as she reached his hiding place behind an overturned wagon. "Don't shoot yet. I've got something better than revenge. I've got proof." The boy turned toward her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face, aged by experiences that no child should have to endure. "Mrs. Hartwell, how did you get here? Never mind that Otto's men killed Papa and burned our house. I'm going to make them pay for what they've done. Your father's death will be avenged through justice rather than more bloodshed." She promised, showing him the leather portfolio that contained Otto's incriminating records. "I have documentary evidence of everything: Otto's conspiracy, Klaus's betrayal, even the confession that proves who really killed my husband and why." She quickly explained what she had discovered at the mine office, while Henrik listened with the intense focus of someone trying to understand adult complexities that would determine his own survival. The documents she had copied included not only proof of the territory-wide corruption, but specific details about Lucas's murder and the broader conspiracy to eliminate anyone who opposed Otto's expansion of power. "There's a federal marshal working undercover in the territory." She continued, remembering Dr. Carruthers' previous hints about outside assistance. "If we can survive long enough to get this evidence to proper authorities, we might be able to bring real justice instead of just adding more bodies to tonight's count." Henrik nodded slowly, his young face showing the struggle between his desire for immediate revenge and his growing understanding that patience might serve justice better than violence. "What do you need me to do?" Before she could answer, new sounds reached them through the storm, multiple horses approaching at speed from the direction of town, accompanied by voices that carried official authority rather than the casual brutality that marked Otto's hired killers. Through the swirling snow, she could see a substantial force of riders approaching the farm with a disciplined formation that spoke of military or law enforcement training. Marshal James Thornton appeared through the smoke and flames like an instrument of divine justice, leading a force of federal deputies who had been conducting their own investigation into territorial corruption for months. The marshal's weathered face showed grim satisfaction as his men spread out to surround Otto's forces with professional efficiency. Federal marshals. Thornton's voice boomed across the farmyard with the authority of legitimate law enforcement. "Lay down your weapons immediately and surrender to territorial justice." Otto's response was to order his gunfighters to open fire on the federal agents, triggering a brief but vicious battle that lit up the night with muzzle flashes and filled the air with gun smoke and the screams of wounded men. But the mine owner's hired killers found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by professionals who had been planning this moment for months, while gathering evidence of the conspiracy they had come to destroy. Within minutes, Otto's surviving gunmen were throwing down their weapons and raising their hands in surrender, recognizing that further resistance would only result in their deaths without serving any useful purpose. The systematic corruption that had plagued the territory for years was finally being challenged by federal authority, with both the power and determination to restore legitimate law enforcement. Otto himself attempted to escape in his carriage, whipping his horses toward the creek crossing, while federal bullets whined around him like angry hornets seeking their target. But Wicassa emerged from the burning barn like a spirit materializing from smoke and flame, his Henry rifle trained on the fleeing mine owner with the steady aim of someone who had learned marksmanship during years of frontier survival. End of the trail, Nonana. The Lakota warrior said quietly, his voice carrying across the farmyard with absolute finality. The confrontation between Otto and Wicassa lasted only seconds, but it seemed to stretch across eternity as two men who represented different worlds and opposing philosophies faced each other across blood-soaked snow. Otto drew a hideout pistol from his expensive coat, but desperation and fear made his movements clumsy and predictable. Wicassa's rifle spoke once, its heavy bullet taking Otto's center mass and lifting him from his carriage seat with the devastating impact that ended his criminal career permanently. The mine owner crashed to the frozen ground, like a falling tree, his expensive clothes quickly darkening with blood, while his pale eyes stared sightlessly at stars that had witnessed countless similar scenes throughout the territory's violent history. As federal marshals secured the scene and began the process of arresting survivors, Leonora finally allowed herself to believe that their nightmare was approaching its end. She handed the leather portfolio containing Otto's incriminating records to Marshal Thornton, explaining what each copied document revealed about the conspiracy that had nearly succeeded in destroying their community. This is comprehensive evidence of criminal conspiracy reaching from local corruption all the way to Washington, Thornton said, after examining the documents with professional thoroughness. Otto's network involved congressmen, territorial officials, and federal contractors who sold their authority for prices that seem almost insulting given the power they controlled. Dr. Carruthers emerged from the barn, supporting Thomas Bell, while checking on the other defenders who had survived the night's violence through courage and determination that ordinary people could summon when pushed beyond endurance. "How did you know to arrive at precisely the right moment?" he asked the marshal. "We've been tracking this conspiracy for months." Thornton replied, his weathered face reflecting satisfaction at a job finally completed. "Dr. Carruthers has been feeding us detailed reports about territorial corruption, and we had additional sources throughout the region who were tired of living under Otto's reign of terror." The revelation that their struggle hadn't been conducted in isolation provided some comfort to the survivors. But it couldn't restore the lives that had been lost or repair the damage that systematic corruption had inflicted on their community. Walter Kruger was dead killed while trying to protect his children from men who viewed human life as an obstacle to profit. His sacrifice had enabled others to survive, but the cost seemed almost too heavy to bear. As dawn broke over the valley, revealing the full extent of the night's destruction, the survivors gathered to count their losses and begin planning for an uncertain future. The burned buildings would need to be rebuilt, and the dead would require proper burial, and the community would have to find ways to heal wounds that went far deeper than physical injuries. Young Henrik and Johann Kruger would need new homes and guardians, but Beatrice Sullivan had already offered to take them in until permanent arrangements could be made. The boys had witnessed terrible violence and lost their father, but they had also seen ordinary people stand together against injustice in ways that might help them understand that good could triumph over evil when decent folks refused to accept corruption as inevitable. "What happens now?" Leonora asked as she watched federal marshals loading prisoners for transport to territorial courts where justice would finally be served. "Trials, investigations, reforms," Marshal Thornton replied. This conspiracy reached throughout the territory and beyond, involving railroad companies, mining interests, and elected officials whose corruption enabled systematic oppression. It will take years to untangle all the connections, But tonight's work broke the organization's power permanently. But for Leonora, the most important changes were personal rather than political. As she stood beside Wicassa in the growing daylight, watching their community begin the process of healing and rebuilding, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Lucas's death, hope for a future that held meaning beyond mere survival. Klaus's body had been found among the casualties. His corrupt career ended by bullets from Otto's gunmen, who had eliminated him as a liability before the federal marshals arrived to restore legitimate law enforcement. Greasy Pete Morrison had died in the burning cabin, his violent life concluded in flames that seemed appropriate for someone who had caused so much suffering through casual brutality. The trials that followed would establish legal precedents for federal intervention in territorial corruption. But the real victory lay in proving that ordinary people could successfully resist systematic oppression when they chose cooperation over surrender to injustice. Spring arrived early that year, bringing renewal to a land that had seen too much violence, but had emerged stronger through the trials that tested its people's character. By June, new buildings were rising in Willow Springs, constructed through cooperation between white settlers and Lakota families who had decided to make the valley their permanent home. The shared struggle against Otto's tyranny had created bonds that transcended racial and cultural differences, proving that mutual respect could overcome prejudices that seemed insurmountable when people allowed fear to govern their interactions. Dr. Carruthers' new clinic served patients from all backgrounds, while Beatrice Sullivan's expanded school welcomed children whose parents spoke different languages, but shared common hopes for their families' futures. Leonora and Wicassa were married in a ceremony that reflected their community's new spirit of cooperation, with Dr. Carruthers performing the legal formalities, while Wicassa's elderly uncle provided spiritual blessings according to traditional Lakota customs. The celebration combined foods, music, and traditions from multiple cultures, creating something entirely new, yet deeply rooted in the shared experience of survival and mutual support. They built their home between the original settlement and the Lakota camp, serving as both residence and symbol of the partnership that was developing between formerly suspicious neighbors. The water rights that had caused so much bloodshed were now managed through formal agreements that protected everyone's interests while preventing future conflicts over resources that nature had provided for all to share. But it was on a quiet autumn evening while organizing papers in their cabin that Leonora made a discovery that would provide the final closure she needed regarding Lucas's murder. Hidden inside Walter's old Bible, a book the German farmer had treasured since childhood in the old country, was a handwritten letter addressed to her, specifically written in Walter's careful script and dated just before his death. The letter contained Walter's complete eyewitness account of Lucas's murder, describing in precise detail how Klaus had forced her husband into the unsafe mine tunnel and shot him to prevent escape before triggering the deliberate cave-in. But more than just testimony, the letter revealed Walter's own tortured conscience and his desperate desire to make amends for his forced cooperation with evil men. "I watched your husband die and said nothing because Klaus threatened my boys. Ein Volkister," Walter had written in his native German before translating his words into careful English. "This cowardice has eaten at my soul every day since. But I was too afraid to speak truth that might bring harm to Henrik and Johann. Now that I face my own death, I want you to know that Lucas died trying to protect the water rights that belong to all people, not just those with enough money to buy corrupt officials." The letter continued with specific details about Klaus's methods and motivations, providing legal testimony that could have convicted the sheriff if he had survived the night's violence. But more importantly for Leonora's peace of mind, it confirmed that Lucas had died as he had lived, fighting for justice and the protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. "What will you do with it?" Wicassa asked gently as she finished reading Walter's final confession. Leonora sat quietly for several minutes, thinking of Lucas and the dreams they had shared of Walter and his ultimate sacrifice for redemption of all the people who had suffered because of systematic corruption that treated human lives as acceptable casualties in pursuit of profit. Then she rose and walked to their fireplace, where a small fire burned against the autumn chill that reminded her winter would come again, but could no longer frighten her as it once had. Justice has already been served through proper legal channels, she said, feeding Walter's letter to the flames where it curled and blackened before releasing its secrets into smoke that rose through the chimney to dissipate in the clean mountain air. Klaus is dead, Otto is dead, and their conspiracy has been destroyed through evidence and federal intervention. Lucas has been avenged, Walter has found his peace, and we have a future to build together. As the paper disappeared into flames that seemed to purify rather than merely destroy, she felt the last vestiges of anger and hatred, leaving her heart like a physical burden being lifted from her shoulders. The past was past with all its pain and loss, but it had also taught her that love could survive even death when it inspired others to continue fighting for the values that gave life meaning. That evening, as the first snow of winter began to dust the peaks around their valley, they sat together on their porch and listened to the sounds of Willow Springs preparing for another season of survival and growth. Children's voices carried across the distances between homes, calling good nights to friends whose families represented different cultures, now learning to see diversity as strength rather than threat. "You know what I think," Leonora said, taking Wicassa's weathered hand in both of hers, while watching Henrik and Johann Kruger playing with Lakota children in the last light of day. "What's that?" he asked, his voice carrying the contentment of someone who had found peace after years of struggle against forces that seemed too powerful to defeat. "I think we've built something that will outlast both of us. Something worth every sacrifice it took to create something that honors both the dead who fought for justice and the living who will carry their dreams forward into whatever future awaits." Wicassa squeezed her hands gently, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight from their windows as he considered her words with a thoughtfulness that made his opinions worth hearing. "The water still flows?" he observed, nodding toward the spring that continued its eternal journey from the earth's depths to sustain all life around it. "As long as that remains true, this place will remember what we accomplished here together." In the distance, the spring bubbled clear and constant, its never-sleeping voice serving as a reminder of continuity. In a world where so much changed with each passing season. Around its life-giving waters, the community of Willow Springs prepared for winter with the confidence of people who had learned that cooperation produced better results than conflict, that justice could triumph over corruption when ordinary folks refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did on the frontier, where survival remained a daily choice rather than an assumption. But they would face whatever came together, drawing strength from each other and from the bonds they had helped forge between people who had every reason to distrust each other, but had chosen instead to build something better from the ashes of a criminal empire. The war for Willow Springs was over, its battles won not through superior firepower, but through the stubborn courage of ordinary people, who understood that some principles were worth dying for, and all principles were worth living for. Peace had come to stay, carried forward by those who had learned that the best victories were those that left everyone stronger and more hopeful than before.